cutie, I'm back. And today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you're new here, welcome to my channel and welcome to the cute side. Today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, it is a lover and collector of books like me. Today's book is a classic. It's Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame, and this came out in 1908. Now, Wind in the Willows is one of those books I think we usually read in, I don't know, 6th grade maybe? I don't know, I can't really remember. I don't even remember reading this book. What got me interested in reading this book is that one of my favorite movies of all time, The Adventures of Mr. Toad, is based on Wind in the Willows. And so I wanted to hear where that story came from. If you haven't seen The Adventures of Mr. Toad, you are missing out. Now, it's an old one. I think it came out in the 30s, maybe the 40s. So it's not as fancy as, you know, some of the newer Disney movies, but it is freaking hilarious. Mr. Toad to me is so funny. I quote him all the time. And so yeah, I just wanted to see where the idea of this character came from. Now, Wind in the Willows, it's about little animals. These aren't human beings. His name is Mr. Toad because he is a toad. That's not just his name. And there are several different storylines going on within the book, but I'm gonna just focus, for the sake of time, and because it's my favorite, I'm gonna focus on Toad's story. And also, spoiler alerts, if you're thinking about reading this book and you don't wanna know anything about it, don't watch this video. If you're maybe thinking about reading it or you just wanna get an idea of what it's about, this would be a good video for you. So, if you want to hear a summary of Wind in the Willows and watch me do my makeup at the same time, stay tuned. Brownie. Now this story starts with Rat and Mole, and they're out on the riverbank and they're having a picnic together. Rat and Mole had kind of just recently became acquainted. Mole lives underground normally, and he decided to come out from under the ground. He wanted to see the world and experience what was going on. And he ran into Rat and they quickly became friends and they kind of became like roommates. So anyway, they're out on this picnic and they run into Otter. Now, it seems that the riverbank residents love to gossip, it seems. And so, Otter tells Rat, he's like, did you hear? Toad, Mr. Toad, he just got a brand new boat and it's all fancy, latest, you know, thing. And he's had it out on the river. Otter and Rat, they look at each other and laugh. And Rat explains to Mole, who doesn't know Toad, that this is just what he does. He gets on these fads, he gets all worked up into something and that's all he does, and then he quickly, you know, becomes uninterested. He tells them that, you know, one year it was sailing, one year it was punting, and he wanted nothing to do with anything else but punting, wanted to spend his whole days punting. Then last year it was houseboating and they all had to go to his houseboat and pretend they liked it. So it's all the same, whatever he takes up, he ends up getting tired of and starts something new. Now when they're done with their picnic, Rat invites Mole to go back to his place, though it's not as nice a place as Toad's. Now, some days later, Mole asked Rat if he would take him to call on Mr. Toad. He had heard so much about him and he wanted to make his acquaintance. And Rat was like, yeah, sure, we can go right now. Anytime's a good time to call on Toad. So they get in their boat and they go down the river. So on the way, Rat's telling Mole, you know, what a great guy Toad is, how, you know, sweet he is, how much he loves his friends, how affectionate he is. And Mole says, oh, he sounds like a great guy. And Rat's like, oh, yeah, he is. Though, you know, he's not very bright. We can't all be geniuses. And, you know, he is a little on the conceited side, but he's got some really great qualities. Okay, I'm gonna let my skincare set in for a few minutes before we move on to makeup. So they pull up to this estate and Rat is like, oh, here's Toad Hall. And there was a boathouse on the premises, so they pulled their little rowboat in there. And Rat tells Mole, you know, Toad, he is, you know, he's rich and he has the nicest house on the riverbank, but we would never let him know that. So in the boathouse, they see all these great, you know, latest and greatest boats, and they're all, you know, slung up either from the beams or on slips, but none of them are actually in the water. And Rat says, oh, I guess, you know, boating's out now. I wonder what his new latest fad is. So they stroll across the yard and they find Toad sitting in a wicker lawn chair, and he's got a map spread out on his knees. And when Toad sees them, he gets all excited. He tells Rat, oh, I was just thinking about you. I wanted you to come over, and how lucky it was that he turned up just now. Mole introduces himself and compliments, you know, his residence. And Toad is like, oh yeah, finest house on the whole river. Finest house anywhere for that matter. He couldn't help but add in. So Toad tells him, he's like, I'm glad you came because I wanted to show you something. And he's like, come with me. And Rat's like, oh, did you get a new boat? And Toad is like, that silly, boyish activity, I'm done with that. It was such a waste of my time. I've discovered the real thing. The only occupation for a lifetime. I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to this activity. He's like, come with me. So he leads them to the stable yard, and out in front of it is this brand new, shiny gypsy caravan. And Toad's like, see, here's the real life, the open road, the highway, excitement, adventure. I'll show you the world. So Toad tells Rat and Mole that all three of them are gonna go on an adventure that very afternoon. And Rat is like, beg your pardon? Rat's like, no, I'm not going anywhere. And neither is Mole. He's like, right, Mole? And Mole's like, oh, yeah, right, I'm not going either. But it does sound like fun. And so Toad ends up convincing Rat and Mole to go with him. So they get a horse out of his stables and hitch it up to the caravan. So they set off down the road, and as they're going, people are waving hello, good day. Later in the day, they stop for supper on the side of the road, and they get out and sit next to their caravan. And as they're eating, Toad is talking about all the big things that him and they are gonna do together out on this road trip. Then the moon rises suddenly and silently out of nowhere in particular. And they turn in. So as they're falling asleep, Toad says, good night, fellows. This is the real life. He's like, forget about your old river. And Rat says, you know, he actually missed the river quite a bit, actually. And Mole rolls over to him and he whispers, he's like, you know, if you want to go back home, I'll go with you. And Rat is like, no, thanks, but we better stick with Toad. It wouldn't be safe to leave him by himself, and it won't take very long. His fads never last, so we'll probably be headed home soon. But the end of this trip was nearer than even Rat suspected. So the next morning, Rat and Mole, they get up, and Toad slept in, of course. So Rat and Mole, they clean up the camp from the supper before, and they tend to the horse, and then they get breakfast started. And Mole, he actually had to trudge off to the nearest village for milk and eggs because Toad forgot a bunch of stuff. So after all their work was done, Mole and Rat decided to, you know, take a little rest in the field right next to the caravan. And right about this time, Mole wakes up and he's in a really good mood. He's like, isn't this life great? There's no work, no housekeeping. And so they continue on their way down the road. And the next day, Mole and Rat, they make sure that Toad does his fair share of the work. And then the morning after that, Toad, he didn't seem quite as stoked on this lifestyle now. So they continue down the road with their cart and horse. And as they're going along, all of a sudden, they hear the sound of a motor. And they kind of ignore it at first, but then it's getting closer and closer. And pretty soon, a motor car, immense and breathtaking, goes zooming by them. And it kicks up a bunch of dust and it all envelops them and they're coughing. And then the car dwindles off into the distance. I don't think these dogs are ever going to stop barking, so I'm just going to need to continue. So anyway, the car roaring by scares the horse and he rears up on his hind legs and he pushes the car backwards into a ditch. And it's completely totaled. And Rat shouts out to the driver, he's like, "Road hog!" Then Rat and Mole, they notice that Toad is sitting in the middle of the road with his legs stretched out in front of him and he's staring fixedly in the direction of the motor car. And he's got a very satisfied but glazed look over his face. He was like in a trance and he kept making little motor car sounds with his mouth. Then he said, "Oh, glorious stirring sight, poetry in motion, the only way to travel. And to think I never knew." And Mole's like, "Stop being an ass." Toad's like, "If I had a car like that, I would go zooming around town and running carts and horses off the road too." And Mole turns to Rat and he's like, "What are we gonna do about him?" And Rat's like, "Well, right now, there's nothing we can do." He's like, "I've known him a very long time. At this stage, he's in a trance, he's in a craze, and there's nothing we can do about it. So let's try and figure out what we're gonna do about the cart and horse here." Now the cart was completely destroyed. So they unhooked the horse and they started walking the 5 or 6 miles to the nearest town. And Mole's like, "Well, what about Toad? We can't just leave him in the middle of the road. What if another one of those things comes by?" But Rat was like, "Forget him." He's like, "I'm over his shenanigans." And Rat just started down the road. So Mole, being the loyal animal that he was, he followed Rat. But within a few minutes, they heard the pattering of feet behind them. It was Toad. He had caught up to them, though he was still kind of staring and glazed over. Then Toad said to Rat, he's like, "You know, I just want to thank you for coming on this trip with me." He's like, "If you hadn't come, I probably wouldn't have either. And I would have never seen that wonderful sunbeam, that thunderbolt." He's like, "I owe you, my best friend." And Rat looks over at Mole and he's like, "You see?" He's like, "Maybe we can get to the next town and catch a train home." And so that's what they end up doing. So they take Toad home and he's still in his trance. And so they tell his housekeeper to, you know, tend to him. And then they go back to Rat's river house, which Rat is very happy about. Now the next morning, Mole, who was exhausted from the trip, slept in a little. And when he got up, he went and he sat by the river. And Rat comes walking up. He had gotten up early and had gone into town to see some friends. And he's like, "Did you hear? Toad got up early this morning and went into town. And he has ordered himself a very fancy, very expensive motor car." So now it's winter and Rat and Mole, they're still living together. And Mole tells Rat that he would like to meet Badger, another animal that he had heard a lot about, mostly from Rat, and he wanted to make his acquaintance too. But Rat tells Mole that, you know, the badger, he lives in the wildwood, and it's too dangerous to go there during the winter. And Mole's like, oh yeah, you're probably right. So he lets it go. But as the winter goes on, he kind of keeps bringing it up, and Rat kind of keeps putting him off, making up excuses. And he tells Mole that, you know, Badger, he kind of comes around ever so often, so if he does, he'll make sure and introduce him. You know, after a while, Mole, he gets kind of tired of Rat always kind of making excuses and putting him off. So he decides to go into the wildwood to find the badger by himself. But he ends up getting lost, and it's dark and it's cold. So he finds like a little hollowed out tree or a tree stump or something, and he curls up inside of it and goes to sleep. Now when Rat realizes that Mole was missing, he figured that he had gone to the wildwood. And so he goes after him, he finds him, he rescues him from the cold, and then they set out to go back home. And on their way, they stumble upon Badger's house. And since it is freezing cold, they might freeze to death. They bang on his door and they beg to be let in. So the badger, of course, he lets them in and he cooks them supper and he takes care of them. And once they're feeling better, Badger asks Rat, he's like, so how's Toad doing? And Rat is like, oh my gosh, he's wrecked another motor car. He said that he wished that Toad would hire someone to drive him around, but they couldn't convince him because he thought he was just, you know, a heaven-born driver, like the best driver ever. And nobody could tell him otherwise, of course. He had ended up in the hospital 7 times. Now, they all knew that Toad was rich, but he wasn't a millionaire. And with all the new motor cars and damages he was having to pay, he was gonna end up either broke or dead. Now, Rat knew that Badger, he was kind of known for being a very wise animal, and he asked Badger, he's like, you know, since we're his friends, shouldn't we say something? And Badger agreed. He's like, you're right, we are his friends. He's like, we should talk to him. He's like, once spring is here, because he didn't leave his house until then, this time of year, we'll go and we'll sit him down and we'll all talk with him. Now the next day, the Rat, he was kind of eager to get back home. So Mole and Rat, they return home, and in the early summer, Badger came to their door. And he's like, okay, friends, the hour is upon us, the hour of Toad. We need to go and talk to him that very morning because Toad was having another motor car delivered to his house that day. So the 3 of them march over to Toad Hall, and when they get there, they see the car being delivered. There is a bright red car sitting in his driveway, Toad's favorite color. And right then, Toad comes out of the house in all his driving gear. And he sees them and he's excited. He's like, you guys should go for a drive with me. But then he notices their very serious looks on their faces. So Mole, Badger, and the Rat, they grab Toad and they force him inside of the house. And they tell the delivery driver to take the car back. Toad wouldn't be needing it anymore. And Toad's like, what is the meaning of this? I demand an explanation. And Badger tells Toad, he's like, take that ridiculous driving gear off. And Toad's like, shit.
No.
So the 3 of them forcefully remove the driving gear. So Badger explains to Toad, he's like, you must have known it would come to this sooner or later. You've had no regard for anybody. You've squandered the money that your father left you, and you're giving animals a bad name. And us animals, we never let our friends make fools of themselves to a certain point. And Toad, you have reached that point. So Badger proceeds to lecture Toad, and Toad, he starts to feel bad and he starts to sob. Toad, you know, he was kind of a sensitive soul, and he was also very easily converted for a time being to anybody's point of view. Then Toad says that, you know, he really is sorry, that he had seen the error of his ways and he understood, you know, his misguided conduct as being inappropriate. And he said he would give up motor cars immediately and forever. And Mole's like, oh, that's good news. And then Badger says, okay, Toad, he's like, I want you to solemnly promise in front of your friends here that you understand what you've done, that you're truly sorry, that you've seen the error of your ways, that it was all folly. And Toad, he kind of stares off for a second like he's thinking, and he says, no, I'm not sorry. I won't apologize. I don't see the folly in it all. It was glorious. And Badger's like, what? You're backsliding? And Toad tells him, he's like, you know, Badger, you're an eloquent speaker, and you're a good friend of mine, and I love you, and you did have me convinced for a minute. But then, you know, I was thinking it over in my own mind, and I'm not sorry. And Badger's like, okay, very well then. And the three of them grab Toad, and they drag him into his room and lock the door. And Mole is like, you know, we're sorry, Toad, but don't worry, we'll take care of you until you're well. And then the three of them decide that, you know, they probably shouldn't leave him alone. So they decide that they're gonna take turns sleeping in his room at night with him and watching him during the day. So for some days they would do this, and sometimes Toad was sad, sometimes he was fine. Other times he would take the chairs in his room and arrange them kind of like a motor car. And he would sit in the driver's seat and pretend to drive and crash the car, and he'd fall out of the chairs and knock the chairs all over until he was satisfied for a few moments. But as time passed, these painful seizures, they became less frequent, but Toad was becoming more and more depressed. Now one morning, Rat comes to relieve Badger, and Toad asks Rat how he's been doing, and Rat's like, oh, you know, I'm good. He's like, you know, Mole and Badger, they've gone out to run some errands. They probably won't be back till lunch, so me and you, we're just gonna have a nice, pleasant day together. Then Toad, he starts to act like he's very sick, and he asks Rat if he would go and get a doctor for him. He also said to get him a lawyer, that he should speak with one soon. And this worried the Rat. So he ran out of the room, though he didn't forget to lock it behind him. And since Mole and Badger were gone, he didn't really have anyone to consult with over this. So he figured, oh, better safe than sorry, and he ran to the nearest village to fetch a doctor and a lawyer. I mean, Toad, he'd exaggerated illnesses before, but he'd never asked for a lawyer. So Toad watched from his window and watched Rat disappear beyond the driveway. And as soon as he did, he got dressed and he made a makeshift rope out of bed sheets, and he scaled down his wall on the outside, down out of the window, and he jumps down to the ground and he sets out in the opposite direction as the Rat. Now, when Badger got home, he was furious, and even Mole, being as loyal as he is, couldn't side with Rat. And after a few brutal remarks from Badger that can only be imagined, so we'll just pass over them here, they decided that they would stay at Toad Hall and wait for Toad to return on either a stretcher or between two policemen. Now, after Toad had been walking for some time, he came across the Red Lion Inn, and he was pretty hungry from his walk, so he went inside, went to the restaurant, and got himself a meal. And as he was eating, he heard the all too familiar sound coming down the road, and his whole body began to tremble. So a motor car pulls into the parking lot of the inn, and the party inside the car, they come inside for their own meal, and they're talking all about how awesome the car is and how awesome their little trips in it are. And Toad, he's listening to them for a while, but then he decides that he just can't stand it any longer. So he pays his bill and he slips out of the restaurant, and he's thinking to himself that, there can't be any harm in just looking at the car. So he's walking around the car, admiring it, and he's thinking to himself, I wonder how easily this car can start. And before he knew it, he was in the driver's seat. He had started the car and he was driving it around the parking lot. And then he drove it out to the road. And all sense of right and wrong and an oblivion to obvious consequences of his actions were just temporarily suspended. And as he drove down the road, he was conscious of only one thing, and that was that he was Toad again. Toad at his best. Toad the terror of the lone road. And he continued racing down the road, completely reckless of any consequences that may come to him. Now the next scene, we're in a court of law, and he's found guilty of stealing a motor car. And he's given no benefit of the doubt because, well, there wasn't any.
Guilty! Thank you, that is all.
And he's sentenced to 20 years in prison. And the bailiff, he slaps a ball and chain on him, and he drags him off to prison. Now, by midsummer, Toad had grown very depressed. And the guard's daughter would sometimes help him out with light duties around work. And she took a liking to Toad because she loved animals. And she asked her dad if she could be in charge of taking care of Toad because he was so cute. And her father was like, oh yeah, he's just a toad, you can take care of him. And the two of them, they became close. She loved hearing stories about Toad Hall and his other animal friends. And she started to feel kind of sorry for him. She didn't think that, the punishment fit the crime. She didn't think it was that big a deal that he stole a motor car. And Toad, in his vanity, he thought that she liked him, that she had romantic feelings for him. But, of course, nothing could ever happen between them because, she was of such a lower class. Now, one morning, she told Toad that her aunt was a washerwoman who had a contract with the prison. And Toad is like, oh, there, don't worry about it. He's like, I have several aunts who look like washerwomen. And she rolls her eyes and she's like, shut up. She's like, listen, I got a plan to get you out of prison. She said that if he paid her aunt just a little bit of money, that they could make it look like he tied her up, stole her clothes, and snuck out of prison posing as her. Now, Toad liked this idea very much because, one, it got him out of prison, but two, it made him seem like a very dangerous fellow. So they executed the plan. And after what felt like several hours, Toad finally made it outside of the prison and he ran to the train station. Now, when he got there, there was a train headed in the direction of Toad Hall. But when he went to purchase a ticket, he forgot he didn't have any money on him. So he goes out to the platform and he sees the engine sitting there, and the engine driver is, doing some maintenance on it. And he's sitting there wondering what to do when the engine driver, he looks over at Toad and he's like, oh, hello, Mother. He's like, what seems to be the problem? You don't look particularly cheerful. So Toad, he answers him and he's like, oh, yes, sir. He's like, I am a poor washerwoman and I have to get home tonight. She's like, I've lost all my money and I can't pay for a ticket. And the engine driver, he feels bad for her and he assumes that, she's got kids at home. And Toad is like, oh yes, as many as you can guess, and they'll all be hungry and playing with matches. So the engine driver, he feels bad for her and he makes her a deal. He says that, if he gives her a ride, that when he gets home, or he thinks, when she gets home, if she washes a few of his shirts for him and then sends him back, he won't charge her for the ride. And Toad's misery immediately changes into rapture. He's like, okay, and he jumps up into the engine cab. Then after some time, the engine driver, he leans over the edge of the engine and he looks behind him, and then he turns to Toad and he says, he's like, it seems like we're being pursued by another engine. And there's a bunch of policemen and obvious plainclothes detectives screaming and yelling. They've got their revolvers in there and they're saying, stop! Stop! Then Toad falls to his knees and he confesses everything to the engine driver. Now, luckily for Toad, the engine driver did not like cops, so he would help him escape. He told him that, there's a tunnel coming up and there'll be a moment when they won't be able to see them going through the tunnel. So right when they come out of the tunnel, Toad needed to jump from the engine and the cops wouldn't see him and they would just continue to chase him and his engine. So as they exit the tunnel, Toad jumps from the engine down an embankment, and then he jumps up, he's unhurt, and he goes and he runs into the forest to hide. And then both of the engines continue down the track, and Toad starts to laugh. But he soon stops laughing because he realizes it's cold and it's dark and he's in a forest he's not familiar with and he's got no supper, so cold and tired. He makes himself a little bed out of sticks and leaves and he goes to sleep in the hollow of a tree. Now when Toad wakes up, he remembers, oh yeah, I'm free. And so he starts down the road and there's a canal that's running along the side of it. And he's walking down the road along the canal, and after some time, a horse comes walking up behind him. And he's got a rope tied to him, and the rope stretches back to a barge. He's dragging this barge down the canal, even though, the horse is on the side of the road alongside of it. And the only person on the barge was a stout woman with brawny arms. And the woman on the barge calls out to Toad and she's like, good morning, ma'am. And Toad says, oh, good morning. And he tells her that he's in a bit of trouble, that his married daughter had written and said that there was trouble, but she didn't say what. So being a concerned mother, Toad just started down the road in the direction of her place, not knowing what the problem was, fearing the worst. And she told her that, she even had to leave behind her washerwoman business with her youngest children. And the barge woman asks, well, where does your daughter live? And Toad says that, oh, she lives near Toad Hall. And the barge woman says, well, I'm not going that far, but I can take you part of the way. And so Toad starts running alongside the barge and then jumps on. Then the barge woman tells Toad that, it's lucky that I ran into you because I've got a bunch of wash in the back that I can't get to because I'm busy steering the barge. So she tells Toad, why don't you go back there and that can be your payment for the ride I'm giving you. And Toad did not like this idea. He actually tried to get out of it, but he also didn't want to give up his disguise. So he's like, okay, and he goes in the back to do the wash. Now Toad had no idea how to do wash, but he thought, hey, how hard could it be? So he's at it, but he's not seeming to get anything clean. Now he was at it for about 30 minutes when all of a sudden he heard the barge woman laughing hysterically. And she looks over at him and she's like, "You're no washerwoman. You haven't washed a day in your life." And this, for some reason, upset Toad. And he was like, "How dare you, you common low-class barge woman? How dare you talk to your betters like that?" He's like, "I'll have you know that I'm a toad, a well-known, respected toad." And she looks at him and she's like, "You know what? Yeah, you are a toad." She's like, "Yeah, you're a gross, disgusting toad." And she grabs him and she throws him off the barge into the water. And when he makes it to the surface, he swims to the shore and he catches his breath. But then he starts running after her with indignation and a thirst for revenge. Now the barge woman was laughing at Toad as he ran up next to the barge, and she yells at him, "Why don't you iron your face? Then maybe you'll pass for a halfway decent looking toad." But Toad, he didn't say anything back. He wanted solid revenge, not cheap verbal triumphs. He saw what he wanted ahead, the horse. So he jumps on the horse, he unties the rope, and he goes galloping off with it as the barge crashes into the side of the canal. And the barge woman was shouting, "Stop! Stop!" And Toad's thinking to himself, "Yeah, I've heard that song before." And he and the horse go galloping off. And after a while, the horse kind of got a little tired, so it slowed down to an easy walk, and Toad fell asleep on its back. Now when he woke up, he ran into a gypsy and he ended up selling the horse to the gypsy. He got some breakfast, and by this time his clothes had dried and he was feeling pretty good about himself. He had money in his pocket and he was getting closer to home and safety and friends, and he started just feeling very confident. And as he continued on his walk, he started to think about all his adventures that he had. And when things were seeming their worst, he always found a way out. And he began to really swell up with pride and conceit. Then he heard a familiar sound. A motor car was coming up the road towards him. Now he decided that he wanted to try and hail this car, maybe get a ride home. I mean, that would really show Badger if he showed up from prison in a motor car. So he's hailing the car down, and it slows down and stops in front of him. And Toad recognizes the car as the very car that he had stolen, and the people in it were the people he'd stolen it from. So he falls to the ground in a ball, thinking, "Oh, I'm going back to prison." And the two men in the car, they get out and they're like, "Oh, this poor washerwoman, she must have fainted. Let's get her in the car and we'll take her to the nearest village." Now, once they got him inside the car, Toad realized that he's like, "Oh, these guys, they don't recognize me." And so in a sweet, female voice, he says, "Oh, thank you so much for stopping." Then he uses his womanly wiles to convince them to let him drive the car. He was starting to feel the tremors and the possession rising up in him again. Now the men thought it would be very entertaining to watch a woman try and drive a car. So Toad gets in the driver's seat, but he starts going faster and faster and faster. And the men are like, "Slow down, washerwoman." And this annoyed Toad. He's like, "Washerwoman indeed." He's like, "I'm no washerwoman. I'm Toad, the motor car snatcher, the prison breaker, the Toad who always escapes, the entirely fearless Toad." And then the men, they recognize who this is. So the men, they try to grab Toad, and Toad, he's trying to fight these men and drive at the same time. And he gives the steering wheel a hard turn, and Toad goes flying out of the car. And the car and the two men in it, they go diving into a pond and they get stuck in the mud. And Toad, he picks himself up and he goes running down the road until he's just absolutely breathless and he has to kind of slow down to a walk. And he's thinking to himself again how great he is, how he got away again. Toad always comes out on top. Then only a few moments later, he hears a bunch of policemen coming after him. He turns around and he sees them gaining on him and he's like, oh crap. And in his blind panic, he goes running into the river and the waters were very rapid and they push him down the river. He can't fight the current. So he's trying to like grab on to the side of the riverbank and he finally grabs on, holds on, pulls himself up out of the water, up onto the riverbank, and he gains his composure, and then he sees a face, a familiar face. It was the water rat. So the rat takes Toad into his house and he cleans him up, he gives him something to eat, and Toad tells the rat everything that happened. Then he tells the rat that, he's learned his lesson for real this time and he's ready to be a sensible Toad. He's going to go back home to Toad Hall and turn over a new leaf. And the rat's like, you haven't heard? And Toad's like, heard what? And Rat's like, you didn't hear about the weasels? They had taken over Toad Hall and they claimed it for themselves. Rat tells Toad that, they're eating your food and they're drinking your drink and they're making bad jokes about you. And Toad's like, oh, have they? And he grabs a stick and he goes marching off to Toad Hall. And when he gets to the front gate, a stoat, I'm not exactly sure how you pronounce it. I'm gonna say stoat. And I didn't know what a stoat was, so I looked it up and it was so adorable. I want one. Anyway, a stoat with a gun points it at Toad and he's like, who goes there? And Toad's like, what do you mean, who goes there? This is my house. But the stoat never says a word. He just starts firing at Toad. And Toad can feel bullets whizzing by his head and he goes scampering off back to Rats. And he can hear the stoats laughing behind him. So Rat tells Toad that he's like, it's no good. The weasels had the stoats posted at all hours. Then Badger and Mole show up and they're very happy to see Toad, but they're also sad to tell him about what happened to his home. And they begin talking about, what are they gonna do? How are they gonna get Toad Hall back? And they all had different ideas on what to do. And all three of them were talking over each other. And finally, Badger is like, be quiet. And Badger turns to Toad and he tells him, what would your father think about everything going on, about what you've done? And this makes Toad cry. Badger had been friends with his father. And Badger consoles Toad and he tells him, don't worry about it. We're gonna let bygones be bygones. And he told him that, you're gonna turn over a new leaf now. And he also told him how they were gonna get Toad Hall back. Now, Badger tells them that Toad's father had told him a secret. And Toad, he perks up, he loves secrets. He had told Badger that there was an underground passageway that led from the riverbank to right under the middle of Toad Hall. And Toad's like, oh, no, that's just a rumor. He's like, I've lived there my whole life. I know it inside and out. There's nothing like that. And Badger's like, my young friend, your father was a worthy animal. More worthy than some I know. And he was a close friend of mine. And he told me a lot of things that he wouldn't have told you. He told me not to tell you about it because you can't keep a secret. But that, the information may come in handy someday in case of trouble. And to not tell you unless it was absolutely necessary. He also told them that he had found out there was going to be a great banquet the next night. It was the Chief Weasel's birthday. And that only the stoats would be on alert still. Everyone else would be at this party. So the next morning, they get all prepared, and Toad, he wakes up for breakfast, and Mole is nowhere to be seen until he comes in the front door and he tells them what he'd done. He had dressed up in Toad's old washerwoman dress and then went down to Toad Hall. He told the stoats on duty that he had heard, or that she had heard through the grapevine, that 600 badgers and hundreds of rats were coming to attack Toad Hall and take it back. The stoats began to talk among themselves, and they were like, wait a minute here. The weasels, they get to stay inside and party, and we're gonna have to fight off hundreds and hundreds of animals all by ourselves? That's not fair. But the stoats captain comes along and he's like, ignore this washerwoman. She doesn't know what she's talking about. And he shoos her off. Now at first, everyone was very upset with Mole for doing this. But the badger began to slowly understand his cunning. Now that evening, they got all ready for their expedition. They each had a sword and a pistol and a stick, and they go walking along the riverbank for a few minutes, and they all dive down into a hole. And then they're in this secret passageway, and their expedition had officially begun. So they hurry along the passage until it comes to a full stop, and they're directly underneath Toad Hall, right where the butler's pantry is. So they all push open the trap door, and then they hoist each other up inside, and they find themselves inside the pantry with only a door separating them from the party and their unknowing enemies. So they peek their noses out from behind the pantry door, and they see the party going on. I think this is done. And they hear the head weasel. He's giving a speech, and he's like, I'd like to thank our host, Mr. Toad, the wonderful, the honest, the modest Mr. Toad. Then the badger flings open the door, and they all go running out with their sticks and their pistols. And the weasels start panicking and running in all directions, diving under tables, jumping out windows. There's china and glass breaking. They were all panicked because they had heard the rumors of these hundreds of badgers and rats coming to attack them. Now Toad went straight for the head weasel and attacked him. Now there were only 4 of them, but to these panic-stricken weasels, they thought there was just these monstrous animals filling the hall with gigantic, enormous sticks, and they fled with terror, and the affair was over very soon. They had cleared the room in 5 minutes. Then Badger says to Mole, he's like, why don't you go outside and see what's going on with these armed guard stoats? I have a feeling that they're probably not going to give us much trouble thanks to you. So he does, and when he gets back, he reports that from what he could tell, as soon as the stoats heard the weasels yelling and screaming, they abandoned their posts. So they cleaned up, and as they were cleaning, Toad tells his friends how much he appreciates everything that they had done for him, and especially Mole for his cunning. So they had supper, and they went to bed safe and sound in Toad's ancestral home that they had won back by valor and cleverness, strategy, and proper handling of sticks. So the next morning, Badger tells Toad that, he ought to throw a banquet in honor of his friends to show his appreciation. And, it actually was kind of expected of him. And at first, Toad was like, he's like, I don't have to throw anybody a party. Look at everything I just went through, and I have to throw everybody else a party? But then he was like, well, I could turn it into a celebration of me. So he wrote out the invitations and he had them sent off. And then Rat and Badger, they sit Toad down and they're like, this party is not about you. He's like, they knew him and they knew he would try to turn this affair into a way to brag and to bring attention to himself, but that it was meant to be about his friends. And Toad is like, well, can't I just like sing one little song or give one little speech? And his friends are like, no. And Rat's like, you know, this is for your own good. Sooner or later, you need to turn over a new leaf. And now is as good a time as any. And Toad's like, he's like, okay, friends, you win. From here on out, I'll be a new Toad. And he goes off to his room to start getting ready for the party. Then Badger says to Rat, he's like, you know, I feel bad, but I mean, he's got to learn how to hold his own. He's got to live here. And we can't have him a laughing stock and, you know, vulnerable to weasels and stoats. So then it was time for the banquet and his guests started to arrive. And when Toad enters the banquet hall, everyone starts cheering and crowding around him and congratulating him and saying nice things about his courage and his cleverness and his fighting qualities. But Toad, he only smiled and he's like, oh no, he's being modest. He gives all the credit to Badger and the Water Rat and Mole for his cleverness. He says they were the mastermind. They took up the brunt of the fighting. I was, you know, just in the ranks. I really didn't do much at all. And all the animals were kind of puzzled and taken aback by Toad's new attitude. So the party was a success. Everyone had a good time and were laughing. But some of the animals started to kind of whisper to each other that, you know, things weren't exactly the same. They weren't as amusing at Toad Hall as they used to be in the good old days. And Toad, he was indeed an altered Toad. The end. So yeah, that is Wind in the Willows. I thought it was adorable. I loved this book and I can see me reading it again. Of course, my favorite is Mr. Toad. He's hilarious. I think we all can see a little bit of ourselves in Toad and in Rat and in Mole and in Badger. Now, the first time I read this, I usually read the books twice. Once just, you know, for the fun of it, to get the story. Then I go back and I read it again to make notes. And the first time that I read it, there was a few little things that I was confused about. I didn't really understand the overall message. It ended quite abruptly and a little bit sad. Like, I felt like Toad was broken, you know, his spirit. He wasn't this adventurous, fun-loving guy anymore. But I also understand why. He does need to grow up at some point. We all do. I just felt like there should have been, you know, like a middle ground, right? Anyway, so I mostly felt bad for Toad at the end. Though it is like, well, he did do the right thing. So yeah, I guess that's a question in all of our lives. Do we do what's right or do we do what makes us happy? You know, within reason, obviously. But yeah, when we're trying to grow up and figure out who we are, do we answer that call that's constantly nagging at us? That was a common theme. We didn't go over the other storylines in this book. We just focused on Toad's, but it was the same message in each storyline. All of the characters had their own little storyline that asked the same question. Do I answer this nagging at my soul of something I want to do or be? Or do I do the responsible thing? Sometimes they're contrary to each other. Sometimes it's the same thing. And we have to try and figure that out. So that's the wind in the willows that we keep hearing, calling to us, and a question we need to answer for ourselves. So anyway, that's Wind in the Willows. I loved it. I think even though you've listened to the summary, you should still read the book because there's so much that I had to leave out for the matter of time. And if you have not seen The Adventures of Mr. Toad by Disney, please do it. It's on Disney Plus. It's not very long. It's only like a half a movie. It's like 40 minutes, I think, something like that. But it's freaking hilarious. It is one of my absolute favorite movies from Disney, and Mr. Toad in that movie is one of my favorite characters of all time. Me and my husband are constantly quoting him. So yeah, please read this book for yourself. I think it would bring a lot of value to your life. And if you liked this video, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. Make sure and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss another upload. And I will see you in the next one. Bye. Later in the day, they stop for supper. Later in the and he's talking for so long that suddenly the moon starts to rise as if. Then the moon rises suddenly. Dogs. So how's But as time passed, these painful seizures. Now one morning she told Toad, and the barge woman says, well, I'm not going to Toad Hall. She's like, why don't you iron your face? Then you'll maybe pass for a half-looking, not cheap verbal triumphs. Toad always comes up. And Toad's like, don't go so that you won't miss another uplet there.
This is my career!